Hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I know we always give this plea whenever we're in this room, but if you feel so moved, I encourage you to come toward the front. All right. So on behalf of the Long U.S.-China Institute, I am Emily Baum, and today it is a great honor to be able to introduce Professor Joseph Esherick, who is with us today to talk about his most recent book, Accidental Holy Land, the Chinese Communist Revolution in Northwest China, which was just published this past February by University of California Press. As one of Professor Esherick's last graduate students that he advised at UC San Diego, I am very honored to be able to welcome him here today, but I also feel a tremendous responsibility to get this introduction right. You never know when your advisor is going to evaluate you. Once a graduate student, always a graduate student. So to those of you who know Professor Esherick, you probably know that he has been living with this book for a very long time. I remember that as a first-year graduate student, I would often hear about this mythical book on Shanganming that Professor Esherick was writing. And then later, as a professor, I would talk with Joe about his excitement about going back to China to finally be able to dig into the research for this book, but also his frustrations and disappointments about not being able to access the materials that he had been promised that he would be able to obtain. Despite all of these barriers and setbacks, Joe continued to fearlessly forge ahead with this project, and it is to all of our intellectual benefit that he did. In many ways, Accidental Holy Land is a perfect encapsulation of what motivates Professor Esherick as a scholar of modern Chinese history. Throughout his long and exceptionally productive career, which has included books on the 1911 Revolution, on the Boxer Uprising, and on the Chinese nation as seen through the lens of a single family, he's been driven by a desire to understand why people rise up in protest and how those protests can evolve to become revolutions. He's never been content with applying broad theoretical models to specific Chinese contexts, particularly when those models were not written with the Chinese case in mind. Instead, across all of his writings, he's pursued a fine-grained social analysis, situated within individual counties, villages, and communities, where he's challenged Western assumptions about the nature of things like imperialism, class relations, and rural society, where he has cast doubts on the existence of a monolithic state. And in the case of Accidental Holy Land, where he has even called into question the existence of a coherent communist party. One thing that I personally have always taken away from Professor Esherick's scholarship is that commonly accepted theories are certainly valuable, but that they cannot hold water if the details don't support them. Joe's eye for detail and his rigor as a historian is unparalleled and widely recognized. His book, The Origins of the Boxer Uprising, was the recipient of the Joseph Levinson Prize for the Best Book on Modern China and the John K. Fairbank Prize for the Best Book on East Asian History. The Chinese translation of his book, Ancestral Leaves, was awarded History Book of the Year from the New History Collective. And just this past year, he was honored with an award for outstanding contributions to Chinese studies from the World Forum of Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. As these many awards and honors indicate, if you haven't read Joe Esherick, then you don't understand modern China. So as one final word before I turn the floor over to Professor Esherick, I just wanted to note that Accidental Holy Land is available, open access, on the UC Press website. It is, like all of his works, a rigorous and lucid piece of scholarship. I highly encourage all of you to read it. But if you, like me, prefer a physical copy, you can also purchase copies of the book here. Professor Esherick will stay after the talk to sign copies, and starting at 5, there will also be a light reception out on the patio. So hopefully I did all right with that introduction. And without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Joseph Esherick.
as always, Emily has exceeded any possible expectation, and probably even the truth to some degree. But I thank her very much for that generous introduction. And I am very happy to be here at Irvine again. One of the things that I told prospective audiences and people that might invite me to give a book talk is I don't do these things over Zoom, which I hate. But if you actually can get a live audience for me, I would be delighted to come. And I am indeed delighted to be here. Now, the one thing I am going to have to figure out here is how to advance a slide. Okay, all right. Good. So, accidental Holy Land. First, I don't need to tell most people in this audience, but for those who might not know, the Holy Land refers to Yan, known in China as the Gomingshengdi, the Revolutionary Holy Land. And this was, and as you can see from the slide, is honored today. This is the massive, towering over the much demonized landscape of Yan'an, the museum to the history of the revolution in China, in Yan'an itself, dominated, of course, by a statue of Mao in the front. Yan was, of course, the place where the communist leadership was based from 1937 to 1947. Throughout the 8 long years of the War of Resistance against Japan, always remembering that World War II in China started in 1937, not with Pearl Harbor in 1941. This was the period when the Communist Party really rose to become a significant challenge to national leadership. When the Communists arrived at the end of the Long March in Shanbei, the total component of all the Red Armies was probably not more than 13,000 men. By the end of the War of Resistance, there were 1 million men under arms in the then soon-to-become People's Liberation Army. And 4 years after that, they conquered the nationalists and took over the mainland. So this really was the period in which the Communist Party rose to significant strength and genuine challenge to national leadership. Oops, let's try that one. Yan is also intimately connected with the rise of Mao Zedong himself. In the Jiangxi Soviet, which preceded the Yan'an era, Mao was often in eclipse, even under something that may have been house arrest or in a hospital. Definitely not always a part of the central leadership, and sometimes even in opposition. And it was in Yan'an not only that Mao rose, conquering ultimately in the party leadership Wang Ming, who returned at the end of 1937. By the end of 1938, Wang Ming had been pretty much sidelined. Mao was very much in control. But the Yan era was also the time in which most of the seminal texts of what came to be known as Mao Zedong thought were written. Not only the dense Soviet-inspired on practice and on contradiction, but also the much more famous and in many ways much more Maoist Yan'an talks on literature and art, his military writings on protracted war, and the brief essays that were memorized by so many Chinese during the Cultural Revolution, Serve the People, The Foolish Old Man Who Moved the Mountains, and so on and so forth. And in this sense, the Yan'an era was really the time at which the Mao era begins. Finally, Yan'an and Shanganning, the larger border region of which it was the capital, was the place in which Xi Jinping, the father of China's current president and party secretary, Xi Jinping, rose himself. In fact, one can find reproduced everywhere that Xi Jinping ever had any kind of minor post, a reconstruction of the caves that he lived in, and as in this one, a bust, which is kind of losing its peel there and kind of falling apart a little bit. And I've always thought, the current audience can decide, it really looks a lot more like Xi Jinping than it looks like Xi Jinping himself. Xi Jinping, of course, is the first prince lady to rise to leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. When I first visited Yan in 1970, in 1988 and 89, you hardly saw any evidence of Xi Jinping at all. But going back this time, he's everywhere and has very much become a prominent leader of the Yan'an era. So if you want to understand where the present China came from, I would suggest that rather than look at Shanghai, one probably ought to look at the villages of Shanbei. So that's the Holy Land part. What about the accidental? I stress accidental not only for the broader theoretical purposes that Emily has outlined already, that in trying to understand massive popular movements, one has to look at the details, and in the details, one will find small causes rather than grand theories as important. But also because I think that in many ways the rise of Mao, the Yan'an era, the whole history of the Shanganning of the Northwest Revolution was dominated by a number of small causes, contingencies, combinations of conjunctures of little events and social structures, and that is in the close analysis of those things that the understanding of the revolution will ultimately come. But more concretely, Yan'an, of course, is the end of the Long March. And we've all seen this picture, this map, or some version of it, in which the Red Army leaves the old Central Soviet in Jiangxi and goes by a circuitous route and then ends up in Yan'an. You can see, in fact, at the end of this long march, it ends up in a Soviet that has Yan'an contained within it, which is entirely a fiction. The Soviet that was there didn't include Yan'an at all, which was always under the command of the enemy until Zhang Xueliang removed himself from them. But how was it that Mao ended up in northern Shanxi at all? And if we look at a speech that Mao gave in September of 1935, we find a very different trajectory for the Long March than the one that is now taught in high schools and to college students and in the universities and in the party press throughout the country. Mao, in a Politburo meeting in September of 1935, just as he had reached Gansu after breaking with Zhang Guotao, at present we should engage in guerrilla struggle, fighting towards the Soviet border. This is our basic policy at present, and then he goes on to explain what wasn't that in the problem. So we should be clear about this problem, and through guerrilla warfare, fight through to open an international connection. And with the direction and help of the international, that's of course the Communist International, rest and restore our military strength and increase the size of our army. We absolutely reject the idea that it is wrong to seek help from others. We are a branch of the international. The Chinese Communist Party is but a branch of the Communist International. And Mao says it clearly here. It was understood by all members of the Communist Party, even though it's not much spoken of today. And we can first establish a base on the Soviet border and then expand to the east. Now, the Chinese Communist Party in Yan'an is known for a policy of self-reliance, self-help, building its own revolutionary movement, and the citification of Marxism. What is now called building socialism with Chinese characteristics. But Mao at this time is saying unequivocally, we are but a branch of the international. Now, I would ask you just for a moment to at least imagine, even though historians are not supposed to involve themselves in counterfactuals, what would have happened if Mao had actually gotten to the Soviet border? What would the Communist Party have looked like if it had been built on the Soviet border with Soviet assistance? Wouldn't it perhaps have looked a lot more like North Korea? In any case, that's not where Mao ended up. And why? Quite simply because a little more than a month after this meeting of the Politburo, he read in a newspaper, again in southern Gansu, that there was a Soviet in northern Shanxi, led by Liyue. And according to the newspaper account that he read, that Soviet controlled most of northern Shanxi and had 1 million people in it. This newspaper account was based on an exaggerated speech that Yan Xishan had given in Shanxi, in Taiyan, after having attempted to eradicate the communist himself and had failed and gone back to it. And partly to explain his own failure, had exaggerated on. In any case, Mao then alters the course of the Cultural Revolution. Again, an accident of history, as I would have it. The result of it is having run across this newspaper and discovered that there was a communist movement in Shanbei, and headed the Long March in that new direction. Now, how did that Soviet movement, that communist movement in northern Shanxi manage to persist while all of the other Soviets, all the other communist bases in the other parts of China didn't exist there? And now I've got to find page 4 of my notes, which seem to have disappeared or gotten somehow out of order. There they are. The other thing that I would note about Mao in Yan'an is that when he got there, he found that this so-called base that allegedly controlled most of Shanbei was much poorer. The area was much less populated, and it had no ability to support a large army that would support the kind of ambitions that Mao had at the time. And so Mao immediately set about trying to leave. And first, again, keeping in mind, Mao's not even in Yan'an yet. Yan'an's under. He's over here in Liyue. His first attempt is, okay, let's go east. That's where the Japanese are. And so he leads the expedition into Shanxi, but is quickly blocked there by the local warlords and Chiang Kai-shek's armies. He can't get by this river valley through here. He's driven back with substantial losses. And he next flees over to Bao'an. That's where Edgar Snow will meet him and write his famous Red Star over China. And then Mao figures, can he go north through Ningxia to reach the Soviet border in that way? And so he attempts that. That too fails. And then only finally, saved by Zhang Zhejiang's Xi'an incident in December of 1936, does he manage to secure a ceasefire with the nationalist forces in order to concentrate on resisting Japan. And at that point, the northern Shanxi base becomes secure, and he stays. But Mao never particularly likes staying in Shanbei. And in fact, I think one of the clearest pieces of evidence for that is that after he leaves Shanbei in early 1948, and he lives on for almost another 30 years as the dictator and of all of China, he never returns to Shanbei. Mao never had a soft place in his heart for the area which is known as the source of his revolution. So, how did that Soviet come to be? How did that Soviet come to be? The Soviet that Mao went to altered the course of the Long March in order to get to, that then became the basis for the greatest period of expansion of communist strength in the history of the revolution. How did it, in fact, become China's accidental Holy Land? Now, to get at this, we have to look, of course, if you're an Esherick type, at the ecology of northern Shanxi, and I've got to figure out here, okay. It becomes during the war the place where young urban radical patriots went to toil, live in the caves, dig the caves to live in, and engage in minor handicraft production. I think what they're actually doing here is repairing guns in a little handicraft shop for machine work. How does this become the base of the movement? And here we have to look at the social ecology of northern Shanxi. Now, this becomes a complicated story, which I'm going to only be able to summarize here. And so if I can be afforded a plug, if you read the book, which I will gladly sign for you, you can get the full story. But the brief version is this. Northern Shanxi is notoriously poor, but northern Shanxi is not a single region. And what I'm going to be doing in the next section of this talk is to distinguish this northeastern version here. Yulin is the biggest city up there. That remains in Kuomintang power, Kuomintang hands throughout the War of Resistance. Suida here is the old regional capital. Just north of it is a town called Mijie, which was known as the sort of cultural center. This is where all the best schools in Shanbei were, and it's larger villages, more densely populated, and this area over here in the west, or what is usually called Shangan, the Shanxi-Gansu border, is very sparsely populated, small villages, a lot of vacant land, and this was clear to me when I first visited the area in 1988-89 and started doing archival and field work, but I could never quite figure out how it was that this came about. And so that became a part of this project that always got delayed and delayed, and so I finally tried to figure it out, and actually it was basically with the Berkeley Library and the advantage of COVID that I finally was able to piece this together from the Qing Dynasty sources. And the answer, okay, here. Actually, in this, we're soon going to get into a true experiment here, and I have no idea what it is. The northwest, this is northwest, this is Zhedan County, what used to be Bao'an. And you can see, it's just sort of blank fields. You can't even see a village in here. It's mile after mile of vacant terraces. And you know, there probably is a small village down somewhere in this gully here. But this is the northwestern version of the province. The elite in this area was much more composed of militia leaders who often lived in this kind of fortress-like hill. There are a number of these, Jinding and so that spotted along the countryside. And you see these, they still stand today. The school in which actually Liyue Zhidan's father taught and Liyue Zhidan studied was this kind of small one-room schoolhouse that you would have in the area. As we'll see in a moment, the town in which Liyue Zhidan grew up had only 4 families in it, and that was called a town. And now we have to figure out how to make this video play. You got an idea here? We try. Oh, there? Good. Okay. This actually is the compound that we stayed in 1988, but it's also the compound that Mao lived in the winter of 1947. Mao tended to live in the best cave. This one was built by a returned student from Japan. And this gives you, we're now in the Northeast again. And this now up here is where those caves are. Pardon the lousy and scratchy and bouncing around video. But this gives you some sense of the size of a village that you would find in the Northeast. And it's an enormous village dominated by one big landlord family. And here, again, you're going to have to excuse a couple of jumpy transitions with irrelevant things in them. But we'll soon get to a market scene with literally hundreds of people something that, again, you would never find in the Northwest along the Shanghai border. This, anyone who was in China in 1988 will recognize a familiar kind of clothing that you would see at that time. But this is a very busy village market, as you can see. And you're actually going to see in a moment here. I think my wife has taken the and there's yours truly wandering these markets. The tall foreigner who's not quite as gray as he is today. Okay, let's just go on to over that. I guess it's a start all over again. Well, you can see Maos Cave again. Let me see if I can get this to not. How do I get it to
final?
Not. Oh, there we are. Okay. Somehow we've got to the next cave. So, how did this configuration of the local ecology of northern Shanxi come about? And it came about basically because of events in the Qing dynasty, namely the Muslim Uprising. Now, Shanbei, in fact, and people would talk about this, though, the Muslim Uprising, it was terrible in here, it depopulated the area, and so on and so forth. But there were no Muslims in northern Shanbei. The Muslims in Xi'an, in Shanxi, lived in this Tongzhou region, small settlement in Xi'an, which persists to this day, which stayed peaceful during the rebellion. But it was all in this is the Guangzhou region, this is the Wei River Valley here. This is the one wealthy, well-watered, and productive agricultural zone in Shanxi. And this is where the Muslims lived. When the Taiping rebels in the mid-19th century threatened Shanxi, the local authorities did what they did in all the other provinces. They organized militia of the local communities. But the local communities were either Muslim, Hui communities, or there were Han communities. And so there were Hui militia and there were Han militia. Well, the problem is the Hui and the Han never quite got along. And of course, the one place where they always met was in the local markets. And unfortunately, a small dispute over nothing more than bamboo prices in a local market escalated, got out of hand. The Hui killed a Han leader. The Han started killing Hui and so on and so forth. And eventually the Hui rose up in uprising. And the Hui were driven entirely out of Shanxi. This Hui population was virtually eradicated. And where did they go? They were driven into Gansu. Having been driven into Gansu, this is a very poor region. It's much like the western Shanxi region. They naturally wanted to go home. It was much richer down there. Their homes were there. And so they tried to go down this Liyue River here to get home to Tongzhou. And the result was repeated rebuffs of this. And the result was the utter depopulation of the western region of Shanxi. Note the figure here. This light gray region here is a region where the population of the Republican era, the mid-Republican era of 1935 and on, as the best I can reconstruct from all of the various sources of the time, and the very good 1823 census that were done in the Qing. The 1930s population is less than 50% of what it was in the mid-19th century. So this whole area has been utterly depopulated. And it's basically been depopulated along the course of that Liyue River where the Hui were trying to flee back to their homeland. So that's how northwestern Shanxi became so poor and so underpopulated. And if you look at this same map, you can see that in the area up in the northeast, Yulin and Mijie have actually increased in population at this time. They're more than 110% of the Qing population. The greatest population growth, of course, has come down here in Shannan, which sees its repopulation in that time. There's real growth at that time. But this drastic difference between the northwest and the northeast of Shanbei really comes from the Muslim uprising. Now, with that background, how do we understand the growth of the communist movement in northern Shanxi? Now, the hero of that movement and the leader of the revolutionary forces, the man who is mentioned as the leader in the newspaper article that Mao reads, is Liu Zhidan. His home county is Bao'an, which has now been renamed in his name as Zhidanxian. Liyue was born into a locally prominent family. His father was a militia leader of some sort, probably mostly on the financial side. He, like any young man of ambition, went to school not in his hometown after primary school, but in Yulin in the Northeast, because that was the area where there he joined the Communist Party. He was sent, this is the period of the United Front, he was sent to Whampoa Military Academy, where he served under Chiang Kai-shek, and then came back to make revolution in Shanghai. After a series of failed attempts at the end of the United Front period, and then a series of efforts to subvert local militia units, to turn them over to revolution, Liyue turns back to mobilizing along the Shanxi-Gansu border, working basically with the men of violence who controlled that area, the bandits, the members of the Gulahui, local militia leaders, anyone of that sort who knew how to fight, knew how to shoot, knew how to make warfare in the desolate lands along the Shanxi-Gansu border. But Liyue was a member of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, which was, of course, oops, oh, that's, I'm sorry. This is Liyue's home, which visited in 1988. And this is an indication of Liyue, the revolutionary leader. There were a series of these billboards that were Liu Zhidan, the other leader, and then, of course, Xi Jinping, the father of the president. Now, this, I think we go even beyond this. Oops, sorry, I don't want to go that far. After a number of failed attempts in which Liyue is basically fighting along this border in here, which is hills, sparsely populated, barren of any big settlements, and with no roads or good transport, so that it's a good place for guerrilla struggle. But the party center, which was in, of course, the provincial capital of Xi'an, constantly wanted him to come down to the plains, closer to the city, where he could have proper proletarian leadership, and constantly accused him of fleeing to the mountains and hiding in the mountains, and just engaging in guerrilla warfare rather than carrying out proper class struggle in the form of land reform. But Liyue's unorthodox strategy constantly brought him into conflict with the party leadership. And he was accused basically on two grounds. One, strategic. They didn't like him fighting in the hills. They wanted him to come down and fight on the plains, which were better populated, and there's a possibility of, there were some landlords who you could carry out some class struggle down there. But the other is political. They accused him of not carrying out class struggle because he was himself of a rich peasant background, maybe even a landlord background. And so he was not carrying out a politically correct struggle against the landlords and the rich peasants. This is a time, of course, in the 1930s when Stalin is carrying out his campaigns against the kulaks, the rich peasants of the Soviet Union, And the Communist Party, always obedient to the International, insisted that the rich peasant line was a political error in the two-line struggle, and one had to avoid that as well. Now, how does Liyue get out of this dilemma? First, he has to fail several times. The provincial party at one point insists that he lead his army all the way across the Wei River and fight down here in the Weinan region. He takes his army down there, it gets wiped out. He manages to get back himself with about 12 men, and an army that he built up really only to about maybe 600 men in all, is reduced to a couple dozen again. A disastrous defeat, but it had one advantage. It sufficiently scared the Nationalist Party leadership in Xi'an that they went after the provincial party committee and they busted the provincial party committee. Having arrested the head of the provincial party committee, they got him to defect and then got him to turn in all of his comrades. And so the entire provincial party apparatus was destroyed, and Liyue essentially was liberated. He no longer had to listen to the party because there was no party to listen to. He did everything that he could to try and find the party again and somebody to give him direction, but there wasn't any party to be found. And so he made his own revolutionary way. And that, of course, is the source of his success. Now, more concretely, make sure that I'm on the right, okay. Actually, let me, before I get there, remember that the basic difference in Shanxi is between the bandit-dominated, poorly populated northwestern region and the area, the better, bigger villages, more educated eastern region. This difference was reflected in two branches of the party as well, which had two different configurations. Liyue's revolutionaries were basically military men. They're basically guerrillas. They're basically fighting in the hills. Their strength is guerrilla warfare. But the party in the east, in bigger villages, and with a better school system, was based in the schools. And the young revolutionary leaders were largely the rural intellectuals who had been sent back to teach in these schools, who then led their students, and sometimes the families of the students, along the revolutionary path. So you have a school-based party in the east, and you have a guerrilla-based party in the west. In 1935, after all the other communist bases had been destroyed, Chiang Kai-shek at last has an opportunity to concentrate on Shanbei. And he organizes the warlords of Gansu and Ningxia to attack here from the west. Liyue is driven out of his own base in the west and has to move to the east. Fortunately, at this time, the leader in the east, I've always think of him as a kind of effete intellectual who tries to be a military man, tries to prove himself in battle, gets shot, and is wounded, incapacitated in the winter of 1934, and dies in February 1935. Liyue, just at this time, is driven out of his base and moves into the eastern part of Shanbei. And in the course of the summer of 1935, he manages to take 6 county capitals. Now, in all of his revolutionary career in Shanbei, they had never taken a single county capital. All of this revolution, all of this warfare in the hills, they'd never taken a single county capital. But now, suddenly, they were able to take these capitals, Yanchang and Yanchuan up here, to rather well-populated. This is Ansai here, which was probably mostly taken because it was on the way and it has a very weak wall up there. They then went up to Jingbian, the Baoan, and Dingbian fell. This is what Mao Zedong reads about. This is what Yan Qishan was reporting about. The communists are all over the place. They're taking county capitals and so on and so forth. This was the time, but it happened really basically only because Liyue was able to move his military party into an area where there was a school-based, village-based, intellectual-based revolutionary party in the east. And as you can see, this, these are the first towns to fall. He starts in the east, and he only moves back towards his own region in the west in the course of this entire movement. Now, the reward for success in the communist movement of this period can only be another purge and another disaster. And that's exactly what happens. As just after Liyue carries out this very successful campaign, taking county capitals, seizing a lot of money, gaining a lot of converts, and just at that time, another army comes up from Hubei under Xu Haidong and allies with the ideologues in the party in the east and starts to accuse Liu Zhidan of guerrilla warfare, rich peasant errors, not carrying out class struggle, and not carrying out the proper party line, and so on and so forth. In September of 1935, Liu Zhidan is put under arrest. His chief lieutenants are similarly arrested. Gao Gang, Xi Zhongxun, the other chief military advisors, probably of the order of 200 local cadres are executed, some of them buried alive. You didn't want to waste bullets killing your own men. All of this is only finally brought to an end when Mao Zedong arrives at the end of the Long March. Now, in the conventional story that you will read even in Mao's biography, official biography, it's Mao who orders a halt to the executions. I actually talked to the author of that biography, Jin Chongji, after having searched around in the original sources, not being able to find any contemporary source in which it said that Mao actually ordered a halt to the executions. And one of the reasons I was suspicious is that Mao actually goes through the Soviet capital where Xu Haidong, the guy who had ordered Liu's arrest, was presiding over a meeting. Mao meets with him first and the purge continues. In fact, I'm heavily suspicious of the idea that Mao actually ordered it. But eventually the purge did stop. Liyue and his comrades, Gao Gang and the others, are only arrested and imprisoned. They're not killed. The leaders are not killed. And they are ultimately released. But Liyue is not cleared. Liyue is held to have continuing historical problems. And furthermore, his army is taken from him and given to the man who threw him into prison, Esherick. Liyue instead is given a very small army, a newly created 28th Army. And when Mao leads his campaign into Shanxi, over here, Liyue is told to lead his army to protect their retreat from Shanxi, and probably, I think, trying to prove himself in battle to regain some of his revolutionary credentials. Liyue is shot and killed. If you ask almost anyone in Shanbei how Liyue Zhidan died, and I've even asked one of his brothers, you get either this kind of hemming and hawing, difficult to say kind of answer, or you get an outright Mao killed him. I actually, when I gave this talk in Pittsburgh last week, a Beijing youth who had been sent down to Zhejiang County said, talked about this and said, you know, nobody in Zhejiang has even heard of Mao Zedong. Liyue Zhidan was, and how did he die? Oh, well, Mao killed him. I'm not willing to go that far. If you read the book, you'll see I kind of hem and haw on it myself a little bit, because I just don't think the evidence is clear either way. And I've talked to plenty of party historians who say now Liyue wasn't enough threat to Mao for Mao to kill. But in any case, he did die. Mao doesn't seem to have regretted it very much until considerably later when he realized that Liyue Zhidan was very popular and he was not. This comes up again. However, by this time, essentially the local leadership of the revolutionary movement had been replaced. Mao was now in charge. Mao was the new sheriff in town, and the revolution from this time forward is no longer going to be the Shanbei Revolution. It's going to be Mao's revolution. I'm just going to wrap up. Go ahead.
Just what date are you talking about right now?
We're talking about after 1935. After the fall of 35, 36. What are the lessons now of this story? First, and perhaps most importantly, I think There it does it. First, I would insist here again that accidents are a very large part of this whole revolutionary story. There was nothing inevitable about this revolution. And I've given talks on this in China again and again, and there's always a question and some degree of debate about nasa oranda or 是不是必然的, and that, you know, is this accidental or even random, as Oran means? And I always say, no, it's contingent. And unfortunately, in Chinese, there's not a good word for contingent. Unfortunately, if you look up a contingent in the dictionary, you're going to get Oran, and that's not quite what I want. But in any case, I am very much intent on trying to combat, to some degree, the notion that the Chinese Communist Revolution was inevitable, and in that inevitable victory somehow was represented a legitimacy of the current leadership of the party. And that I'm not willing to concede. And so I'm constantly at battle with the party historians on this. And so although a Chinese version of this book came out even before the English version, it was published in Hong Kong. It was very clear that there's no way that this book could be published on the mainland. Secondly, the revolution was unquestionably violent. And we have to recognize the extent to which violence was an integral part of the revolutionary process. Not only military conflict, and military conflict was extremely important, but we should always recognize, if Ukraine hasn't proven to it again, that victory in military conflict does not always come from superior armaments and better tanks and better artillery and all those sorts of things. Chiang Kai-shek, especially after the war and the USA during the war against Japan, was unquestionably had a better armed, a better trained, a logistically superior military force than the communists ever had. But the communists won. And it behooves us to try to understand how that happened. I would argue that looking, as we long did, for some notion of popular support probably is not the right way to go. It doesn't really require popular support. It requires popular apathy or popular allowing something to happen. And I think, and a simple will to fight on the other side is a critical part of the determinant. But also, we have to recognize the extent of Red Terror. In that massive expansion of Liyue's army and movement and the revolution in northern Jiangxi in 1935-36, all of the sources agree there was a very significant amount of simply bloody terror going on both sides. The communists were shooting school teachers, the nationalists were shooting communists and any suspected sympathizers. This was a bloody struggle, but I would stress here that as it's discussed in the sources of the time, it's discussed as red villages against white villages. It's not a village dividing along class lines against each other. Within a village, the landlord and the tenant are often from the same family. Or maybe they're qinxi or something, they're marital relatives. In any case, they're neighbors, and they may even be friends. So getting class struggle to happen within a village is quite difficult. But between villages was a good deal easier. And so you constantly get discussions of red villages and white villages. Third, superior party organization, which is often a default explanation that many people have ended up with, and that the Kuomintang certainly believed in again and again, recognizing that the communists were much better organized and much better at propaganda and much better at discipline than the Kuomintang was. This is unquestionably true. But organization won't explain everything, because organization can work against you as well as for you, as this story has shown. When the party organization was ordering Liu Zhidan down onto the plains or south of the Wei River, the party organization was showing its strength, and it could force him, even though he had the guns and they didn't, to do things which essentially decimated his army. So organization alone won't explain things. It has to be the organization together with a successful revolutionary strategy and a successful revolutionary base. Finally, I would argue that if for no other reason, then China is now still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. And even though that Chinese Communist Party is not acting in ways that are consistent with Marxism and Leninism and socialism and all of those things that communist ideology deals with, still we need to understand why that Communist Party still dominates China and what the strength of that party is. I would argue that Mao Zedong was certainly important, especially in the Civil War, in the wartime and Civil War period. But Mao Zedong is not enough. And Mao Zedong alone can't explain the revolution. As brilliant a strategist as he probably was, he was not a Superman, and he couldn't control events in that. Peasant revolution, I think, is a concept whose day has come and gone. I certainly grew up in the era when peasant revolution was everything. And what we needed to do was to explain why China had a peasant revolution and Russia had a workers' revolution and the French had a bourgeois revolution, and all of these revolutions were described by their main class component. But peasant revolution doesn't really work for China. The party's leaders were not themselves peasants. And while the peasants were the bulk of the party, as I've argued elsewhere, exactly how the party communicated between its intellectual and military leaders and its peasant base is not a simple question. And it's not as though the peasants who made the base of the party and the bulk of the military forces were in charge. We have to look beyond the United Front with the nationalists. It's undoubtedly the case that nationalism was a key motivating factor, especially for young intellectuals who came to Yan'an during the war and then went out to become the cadres in the base areas behind the Japanese lines. And without the United Front, that simply would not have been possible. But the United Front, again, won't quite explain everything. The Nationalists, after all, were the other part of that United Front. The Nationalists were also fighting the Japanese. Why didn't the United Front benefit them? Why didn't the nationalism rising in China in reaction to the Japanese invasion benefit the nationalists, and instead it benefited the communists? So, finally, again, in my generation, the May 4th movement, the iconoclasm, the attack on Confucianism, the collapse of the old Confucian order, the fall of the gentry class, all of these were resorted to by my initial mentor, Joseph Levinson, and others, as part of the explanation of the Chinese Revolution. But again, that too is unsatisfying. And so the big theories, I think, are not going to get us there. And we need instead to go down to this very nitty-gritty, locally based social history approach to try and find out how this revolution succeeded. I will not claim that the story I just told of Shanbei can then be extended to apply to the revolution elsewhere. The revolution in Shanxi, which is relatively well studied, I know is radically different because they had a warlord there in Yan Xishan who continued to be active and allied with the communists and fought against the communists. The revolution in Shandong was probably another factor again. Every area is going to be different. Every area has to be studied. They're going to become common features, and hopefully out of that we can come to a more complete understanding of the Chinese Communist Revolution. But I would appeal here once more, especially to the younger generation of students still starting out, that don't abandon revolutionary history. We probably overdid it in my generation. Revolutionary history was all that everybody did. Everything was designed to explain the Communist Revolution. But it's still a big problem, and we can't forget it. And we can't always retreat to the cities and the easily accessible archives. And we have to go back to those villages, desolate as they are, in places like Shanbei, or the Shandong Hills, or the Shanxi Highlands, and try to find out what was motivating those people to join and support the revolution. Thank you.
Well, Professor Esherick will entertain questions right now. I'm going to get you some water.
That would be nice.
Talking
Yes, thank
for
you.
a while, so I will allow you to call on whoever raises their hand.
Yeah, the notion of particularism, that is to look at the localities, is extremely persuasive in principle. But then, when you look at the People's Republic, the capacity of China, of the Chinese communists, to impose class struggle on every village, to find landlords in every village. How can one explain that?
Tom naturally comes up with the big and difficult questions, and one that must be both confronted and I'm going to hazard an answer here, but it's an answer that I'll preface with the comment that I haven't studied this. I haven't studied the PRC, and so I'm not going to commit myself to this being the only possible answer. But one of the tendencies that I have observed as I try to make sense of the field and the Chinese Revolution in the course of modern Chinese history is that for many years in the generation before myself, the focus was on the state. Whether we're talking about the history of the imperial period or the history of the PRC. So, in my era, it's Zhang Zhongli writing about the Chinese gentry, or it's Franz Sherman talking about ideology and organization in communist China. And the state dominates. The state has a unified system of examinations. The state has something close to a meritocracy in selecting its officials. They're selected according to a single standard of command of the Chinese classics and Confucian rituals and virtues and so on and so forth. And the state is unified by a single code that's carried out by magistrates throughout the land. The state is unitary. We can talk about the Chinese state as one. There is one Chinese state. And when we talk about the PRC, we can talk about the one PRC state. But Chinese society was always very diverse. And Chinese society was represented by different dialects, in spite of the uniform written language of the elite and the memorials they wrote and the edicts they read and so on. So the state imposed a kind of unitary standards on everything, but the society was very different. One of the experiences that my generation had when we first went to China in 1979-80 was, my God, this country is very diverse. I'm sitting here in Shandong, and then I go down to Wuhan, and Wuhan is full of working people fighting with each other in the streets in New Year's. I go up down to Shanghai, and you go to the Bund, and it's all these Western houses and people wearing Western style clothing and so on and so forth. I go up to Tianjin and have not only gobri bao, but I have the Western pastries at Jixilin. I go to Hunan and I see villages with one surname, and I go to the North China Plain and I see villages with multiple surnames. I go to Guangzhou and I see all one family in a village. Chinese society is very diverse. Now, to address your question more concretely, and pause and take a big drink of water to try and get the thoughts together. On the one thing, China has a much stronger state now than it ever had before. And so the state's ability to impose a uniformity on the society is much greater than it ever has been before. But even this powerful Chinese state has found that in, for example, carrying out its mandate in the villages, it often works better if it works through lineage organizations or temple organizations or something that has a degree of local legitimacy. So society is always penetrating the state apparatus to some degree or another. Now, the state's always struggling against that. And we're seeing it struggling against it now, whether it's in controlling COVID or whatever. The state, this unitary state, this insistence that everything is going to be done on one set of rules, this idao ideology of the party, is always struggling against the diversity of society. I don't think that battle is over. I don't think society is ready to give up and surrender. We can see that in the persistence of local dialects. We, of course, especially see it in the strength of minority nationality identity, which refuses to conform to Han ideals. And I think that struggle will continue to go on. How the final combination of this dialogue, the resolution of this dialectic is going to work out between a unitary state and a diverse society, I don't think that's known yet. And historians have enough difficulty predicting the past that we shouldn't get around to try to predict the future. But I do think, I mean, that's the basic way in which I think this story ought to be addressed. Yeah.
I'm listening to your talk, I kept thinking, okay, here he's moving completely away from early work on the 1911 revolution, and then the Boxer moment, and he's coming up forward. But I saw some echoes of the earlier work. When you were talking about, when we think about the villages, we should really think about red villages versus white villages. You're much into the kind of ecology of the Boxer thing, where it's really about villages against villages violence comes in a lot. And also the whole approach, a kind of ethnographic approach and taking ecology seriously. But the other part I was thinking about, if you say that the 1911 revolution is contingency, accidents, things that kind of happen together in a confusing way, that's kind of how we've always thought about 1911. To say 1911 was an accidental revolution, where it wasn't really planned, it was contingent things that all, you have to study them in different places. That's in some ways what you're calling for, it seems to me, for 1949, that somehow we thought of 1949 as the result of a more coherent process. And we thought of 1911 as a kind of mix of things and largely the mistakes that the Qing made. So one thing I was wondering in your list of things that help to explain it, is part of it like if you move away from Mao making all the right moves, it is partly back to the nationalists also made a lot of mistakes and squandered a lot of opportunities. So you have, and maybe that's maybe just one more thing that's not enough to explain it, but is another of the explanations that have been offered, was that it was not about the Americans lost China, but Chiang Kai-shek lost China would be one way of thinking about it. So I just wondered, partly if you see, did you find yourself feeling a sense of, this is familiar? You thought of red villages versus white villages, Christian versus non-Christian, appealing to different sources of authority, and just how you reacted to this kind of thing.
Well, I have to answer on a number of different levels here. On the one hand, it occurred to me in thinking back, as one does when one reaches 80 on a long career, I had the fear that I've been writing the same book over and over again. There's always a big, long introductory social background chapter, and then there's a detailed working out of the narrative of revolution. And whether it's 1911 or Boxers or this, it's the same structure that I always fall back on. So in that sense, I think there is a lot of similarity here. On 1911, my most recent thinking about 1911, and of course, because they do in China these 10-year anniversary conferences that I always get invited back to, and so I've had a number of occasions to rethink my ideas about 1911. And the last conference I went back to on the 100th anniversary, my talk was something about a sudden revolution. And the idea there, which wasn't quite accidental revolution, but I probably could have called it an accidental revolution. I call it a sudden revolution partly because this was just after the Arab Spring. And I wanted to suggest that who would have thought that Mubarak would fall in 2010? You know, absolutely unthinkable. And suggest, therefore, that you know, who would have thought that the Communist Party could possibly be threatened, and at least put that seed out there with a few asides to suggest what I was talking about. But part of the argument for the sudden revolution was that the reason in my current thinking that 1911 happened was basically because Cixi died and Zaifeng took over the throne as Qin's regent. And he was about as lousy emperor as you could possibly have. He did everything wrong. And he, at a time when constitutional reforms were supposed to give Han Chinese a voice in governance, he set about Manchuizing the entire apparatus. So he appointed his brothers as Minister of War and Minister of Finance and so on and so forth. And the so-called Huangzu Nege, the Prince's Cabinet, was appointed in the spring of 1911. And one of the things that I had noted in my early book is that these revolutionary organizations, which had only a couple hundred people in them in 1910, suddenly had thousands in the summer of 1911. People started moving to the revolution very quickly. But the revolution in Wuhan, accidental as it was, bomb blast sets it off, was carried out basically by Han nationalists. And the so-called, you know, Shibaxinqi, the 18-star flag, which represented the 18 provinces of China proper, which if that had been the revolution, then Xinjiang, Tibet were out, Mongolia was gone. And when it came to the constitutionalists in the lower Yangtze, to Jiang Jian and the others, they weren't going to have any of that. So they quickly got rid of that flag, and they settled on the 5-bar flag with all of the nationalities involved in it. So 1911 is really a abdication of the elite. It's a revolt of the elite. These are the guys who were the provincial assembly leaders and the military leaders who basically said, we want to keep the Qing order. We just want to have it called a republic now. So I, in that sense, 1911 was accidental, 2 was sudden as well. But to understand 1911, you've got to understand why the elite defected. Now, on your final point, I couldn't agree more on Chiang Kai-shek lost China as much as Mao Zedong won it. I reworked an old article that I wrote, which on reflection had not been as convincing as I thought it was at the time, on war and revolution. The main point of which, or the main point as it's now reconfigured, is that one, the war was as important as the revolution in transforming China. And the war basically delegitimized Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party so that its armies were no longer willing to fight for it. And the people opted for the communists, not so much because they were enamored with the communists, but because they thought they could carry out the national revolution of the Kuomintang better than the Kuomintang could. The communists were at least non-corrupt, hardworking, disciplined, effective. They could carry out Chiang Kai-shek's revolution better than Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party could. It's Chiang Kai-shek's failure, but it's not necessarily the failure of, in a sense, Sun Yat-sen's revolution. Sorry?
I just thought I would let you know that for years I taught the 1911 revolution causes from a section of your book. And there were, I think, 4 or 5 main factors looking at the whole picture. And I can't give that up. I mean, no matter how much you talk about localities, I think you're going to have to put it into a big picture. So like Tom said, it explains more than this area. I mean, find some big explanations for what that this area fits into, why then and all that.
Tom and I were just talking. Tom's 85 now. I'm 80. It's time for the next generation to step up.
Just yesterday, he became 85.
I still got a few days to go before 80. But anyway, I do think that I'm just going to make the appeal that other people are going to have to do this. And it's not for our generation to speak anymore.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Professor Esherick again for this talk. Feel free to stick around. There are some refreshments outside, and buy a copy of his book. And thanks again for coming.